Deep within the darkest corners of the internet, a toxic subculture was beginning to fester, fueled by rejection, isolation, and a burning hatred for society. In 2014, the world would shocking look upon the rise of the Incel movement following a notorious mass tragedy in Isla Vista, California. But while the media focused on the horrors across the Atlantic, an identical nightmare was quietly unfolding in the historic coastal city of Portsmouth, England. There, a disgruntled teenager was retreating into the shadows of his bedroom, meticulously planning an identical campaign of terror. Driven by an inability to fit in and a warped desire for vengeance, he decided that his only path forward was to become a monster. He didn't want to just lash out. He wanted a body count that would rival the most infamous names in criminal history. While his peers were planning their futures, this 17-year-old was staring into his computer screen, studying the mechanics of human slaughter. He convinced himself that society had dealt him an unfair hand, and that the only way to reclaim his dignity was to steal the lives of innocent strangers. The quiet streets of Hampshire were about to become his personal hunting ground, and the unsuspecting residents had no idea that a self-proclaimed monster was walking among them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ben Moynihan was born in 1996, growing up in an unremarkable, seemingly supportive household within the Portsmouth area of Hampshire, England. To the outside world, his early life appeared entirely ordinary, but beneath the surface of his daily routine lay a deeply troubled school experience. In the classrooms and hallways, Ben was the target of relentless, cruel mockery from his peers. Classmates would later recall how groups of boys would systematically trick him into humiliating situations, coaxing him to perform ridiculous dances or make a fool of himself. Completely oblivious to the fact that he was the butt of the joke, Ben would eagerly comply, thinking he was finally being included, while his tormentors recorded the spectacles to mock him further on social media. This profound inability to read the room stemmed from a critical factor that would remain unrecognized. For years, Ben was living with undiagnosed autism spectrum disorder. He lacked the social tools to differentiate between genuine camaraderie and malicious deception, leaving him entirely vulnerable to psychological warfare. The girls in his class weaponized this vulnerability in an even more sinister fashion, cruelly pretending to be attracted to him. They would drape themselves over his shoulders and loudly proclaim that he was their boyfriend, treating the very idea of loving him as a hilarious, ironic punchline because they viewed him as entirely undesirable. Tragically, Ben took their words literally, and whenever he saw these same girls holding hands with other boys, a deep, poisonous sense of betrayal began to fester inside his chest. As the psychological torment wore him down, Ben retreated entirely into the isolation of his bedroom, where his pain slowly curdled into an obsessive, malignant hatred. To pass the hours alone, he began drowning himself in the macabre histories of notorious serial killers, searching the internet endlessly for every horrific detail he could uncover. He developed a particular, intense fixation on Brady, one half of the infamous Moors murderers who terrorized Manchester in the 1960s, and Dennis Nilsen, the necrophilic predator who slaughtered 12 young men in London. Watching the dark legacy of these men, Ben came to a chilling realization. He didn't just want to read about serial killers anymore. He wanted to become one. By the time he turned 17, he began using his computer webcam to document his descent into madness, recording a series of venomous video diaries that detailed his bleak outlook and intense sexual frustration. He was consumed by bitterness over his virginity, a fact he blamed entirely on what he perceived as the deceitful, hyper-selective nature of modern women. Brandishing a large kitchen knife in front of the lens, he addressed his future victims with a chilling calmness, asking whether he should pierce their hearts, sever their throats, or simply set them on fire. He openly pondered how difficult it could possibly be to acquire petrol, explicitly stating that he wanted to teach women a lesson they would never forget. Demanding a twisted form of respect for men just like him, the teenage boy did not confine his dark fantasies strictly to video format. He began drafting a physical manifesto that would later be chillingly labeled by authorities as his diary of evil. Within these hidden pages, he explicitly laid out his philosophical justifications for targeting women, writing that he viewed them as a fundamentally weaker subsection of the human race. In other passages, his tone shifted from twisted biology to raw, unadulterated vengeance, flatly stating that murdering women was his rightful retaliation for the lonely life he had been forced to endure. Added to this toxic mix was an overwhelming anxiety about his impending high school graduation, a milestone that brought him nothing but dread because he had absolutely no prospects for employment. He felt an intense, crushing guilt over the prospect of his parents supporting him indefinitely, and he concluded that he simply could not survive a future confined to his childhood home. In his diary, he desperately tried to rationalize his violent urges as a self-sacrificing act, writing that he was forcing himself to do this to save his family from the burden of his existence, unlike the serial killers he idolized, who painstakingly lured their victims into private spaces. Ben decided that his method of execution would be sudden, chaotic, and entirely public. To prepare for the upcoming slaughter, he hung a heavy winter jacket on a hanger in his room, repeatedly stalking and stabbing the fabric with a kitchen knife until the material was reduced to shredded rags. By June of 2014, the 17-year-old decided that his period of rehearsal was officially over and the time had come to spill blood. On the afternoon of June 20th, he slid a 4.5-inch kitchen knife into his pocket, walked out his front door, and began hunting the streets of Portsmouth. He eventually migrated toward Southampton Road, positioned across from a complex of apartments, where he spotted a young woman walking completely alone. Her eyes were fixed entirely on her smartphone as she browsed social media, totally detached from her physical surroundings. Suddenly, she felt a brutal, heavy impact against her chest that she initially assumed was a random, aggressive punch from a passing stranger. Looking up in confusion, she saw a young boy sprint away from her and vanish down a nearby alleyway, leaving her to believe she had simply been the victim of a senseless juvenile prank. It was only when she looked down at her clothes that horror set in, revealing an ocean of deep crimson blood erupting from her chest. Terrified, she dialed emergency services, her voice shaking as she screamed into the receiver that she could actually hear, her own life force splashing onto the pavement beneath her feet. She was rushed into emergency surgery and miraculously survived the devastating wound, completely unaware that her attacker was already back on the streets, actively searching for a second target. The thrill of his first strike only whetted the boy's appetite, though his subsequent attempts were repeatedly frustrated by crowds and witnesses, forcing him to bide his time for over a week. On the morning of June 29th, he set out once again, wandering down a popular scenic footpath that bordered the shore of Ports Creek in Hillsia. This particular trail was highly frequented by local dog walkers, including a 45-year-old woman who was enjoying the morning air with her pet. As she walked, she noticed a young man approaching her from the opposite direction, his hands tucked mysteriously behind his back. Assuming he was simply holding a leash for a dog lagging somewhere behind him, she offered him a polite smile and a warm morning greeting. The boy returned the greeting, but as the distance closed, the woman realized with a jolt of panic that there was no dog, and his pace was accelerating aggressively toward her. For a split second, his awkward body language made her think he was strangely moving in for an unwanted hug, or perhaps preparing to perpetrate a sexual assault. Before she could react, the teenager whipped the kitchen knife from behind his back and plunged it directly into her chest. Just like before, he immediately turned on his heels and fled into the distance, leaving the stunned woman bleeding on the path, her immediate, panicked thoughts entirely consumed by the fear that the monster would return to kill her dog. Against all odds, the second victim managed to call for help and survive the horrific assault, prompting the Hampshire Police to immediately link the two stabbings due to their identical, terrifying execution. Back in his bedroom, the teenager was entirely convinced that his victims had died, and his ego swelled with the delusion that he was now an official, operating serial killer. Desperate to taunt the authorities and claim his dark prize, he printed a chilling manifesto on a bright piece of blue paper and boldly slapped it onto the windshield of a parked police van. The letter, which investigators later discovered had actually been composed weeks prior to the first attack, introduced the world to a terrifying new persona. Within the letter, the writer mocked the police, declaring that, while his true identity remained hidden, he wanted them to know he was not a traditional psychopath, but rather the unhappy Geyser. He poured his heart out onto the page, demanding to know why women were so impossible to please, why employers constantly rejected his applications, and why the world was so inherently aggressive toward him. He lamented his profound loneliness and history of being bullied before making a bizarre request to the police. He asked that when he was inevitably sent to a maximum security psychiatric facility like Broadmoor, he'd be allowed to bring his laptop along, not for the internet, he claimed, but simply to have something to keep him occupied. The bizarre letter concluded with a poetic, bloodthirsty promise, warning the police that until they caught him, he would continue to roam the streets hungry for agony, chanting the words "attack, attack, attack," until his victims were dead. Along with his chosen moniker of the unhappy Geyser, the teen also adopted a specific, ominous symbol to leave behind, an insignia pulled directly from the video game Tomb Raider 2, representing a fictional, murderous cult. The brazen, daytime stabbings sent a wave of absolute paranoia through the Portsmouth community, with residents terrified to walk the streets alone, completely oblivious to the fact that the predator was a local kid. As the public panic reached a fever pitch, the young man continued his sinister hunt, actively stalking at least 10 different women across the city. In several instances, his deadly plans were thwarted by the sudden appearance of a vehicle or a passing witness, forcing him to abort his swings at the very last second. He remained patient, waiting for the perfect moment of isolation, driven by the dark thrill of the chase and the absolute certainty that his name would soon be feared across the country. By the time mid-July arrived, the teenager made a frustrating discovery through local news broadcasts. Both of his previous victims had defied his expectations and survived their wounds. Infuriated by his inability to successfully take a life, he consciously shifted his strategy, deciding that he needed to target someone far more physically vulnerable to ensure a lethal outcome. On July 11th, he found his ideal target in a quiet alleyway connecting Cole Road and Northern Road, a bustling footpath used by locals walking home from the nearby shopping district. Walking toward him was a frail, 66-year-old grandmother, carrying her groceries and completely unsuspecting of the young man approaching her. As they crossed paths, the boy moved with blinding speed, pulling his trusted blade and burying it deep into the elderly woman's chest before sprinting away into the labyrinth of side streets. The bewildered woman stood frozen in the alleyway, staring down at her clothes for several long moments before the reality of the piercing pain finally registered in her mind. She managed to summon emergency services and, in a stunning testament to her resilience, she too survived the brutal puncture wound. The community was left reeling from 3 near-fatal assaults. But just as the police felt completely blind in their investigation, the killer made an arrogant, catastrophic miscalculation that completely shattered the trajectory of the case. On July 30th, the Hampshire Police Department, feeling the immense pressure of a terrified public, made a desperate move and arrested a 30-year-old local man on suspicion of the stabbings. Watching the news unfold from his bedroom, the true attacker was consumed by an explosive, narcissistic rage. He absolutely could not tolerate the idea of an innocent man stealing the credit for his masterful handiwork. In an act of pure arrogance, he sat down at his computer and drafted a second, furious letter to the authorities, explicitly mocking the intelligence of the entire police force. He proudly listed the exact dates of his 3 strikes, pointing out that he was only 17 years old, while the man they had locked up was 30 DOT. The letter quickly escalated into pure sadism, with the teenager boasting that all women deserved to perish, and expressing a sickening hope that in his next attack, he would gouge his victims' eyeballs out. He claimed that after every stabbing, he would run back to his apartment, just to savor the smell of the human flesh he had ripped away from his targets. Then came the ultimate, prideful reveal. At the very bottom of the page, the boy printed a crystal-clear high-resolution photograph of his own face, daring the detectives to come and find him before he hunted down a 4th victim. The police didn't have to search long for the face in the photograph, because just 2 days later, the arrogant teenager was spotted casually strolling past a patrol unit in the center of town. Recognizing him instantly from his self-submitted portrait, officers wrestled 17-year-old Ben Moynihan into the back of a squad car, where he immediately erupted into a series of chilling declarations. He spat out that all women needed to die, openly admitting to the officers that his goal was never to merely injure his victims, but to permanently end their lives. He smugly told the arresting officers that they were incredibly lucky, because at the exact moment they threw the handcuffs on his wrist, he was actively hunting for his 4th target. During his high-profile trial at Winchester Crown Court, the defense desperately tried to argue that Ben had only intended to cause superficial wounds, a claim the prosecution utterly demolished by presenting his own video diaries, his diary of evil, and his formal diagnosis of a profound, dangerous lack of empathy. On March 6, 2015, the teenage boy who dreamed of becoming an infamous serial killer was found guilty on 3 counts of attempted murder, and sentenced to 21 years behind bars. The horrific legacy of the unhappy Geyser remains forever etched into the scars of 3 women who simply went out for a walk and came face to face with pure, unadulterated hatred behind the concrete walls of a high-security prison. The boy who once demanded dignity through bloodshed now spends his nights weeping in his cell, finding himself the ultimate target of the very bullying he sought to escape. His terrifying video diaries remain locked away from the public eye forever, hidden by a judicial system terrified of the poison they might spread if unleashed upon the world. He sits in the dark, counting down the long, agonizing decades until his projected release in the year 2036. Remember, the most terrifying monsters don't hide under the bed. They walk among us in the daylight, holding a knife behind their back.